Hi everyone, and welcome to another part of Capablanca's Chess Fundamentals. The customary quote: "You must also have the courage of your convictions. If you think your move is good, make it." From the maestro Capablanca himself. A brief review of the last part, where we continued our discussion on control of the center and then concluded chapter 1 after discussing the last topic in it, traps. In chapter 2, we discussed the topics: a cardinal principle, a classical ending, obtaining a passed pawn, how to find out which pawn will be the first to queen, and the opposition, all with supporting illustrations given by Capablanca. So now, moving further into the book, Capablanca continues the discussion on the opposition. He writes, Example 28. The following position is an excellent proof of the value of the opposition as a means of defense. White is a pawn behind and apparently lost, yet they can manage to draw as follows. King h1. The position of the pawns does not permit white to draw by means of the actual or close opposition. Hence, white takes the distant opposition. In effect, if King f1, actual or close opposition, King d2, King f2, King d3, and white cannot continue to keep the lateral opposition essential to their safety because of their own pawn at f3. On the other hand, after the text move King h1, if King d2, King h2, King d3, King h3, King e2, King g2, King e3, King g3, King d4, and King g4. Attacking the pawn and forcing black to play King e3 when white can go back to g3 as already shown and always keep the opposition. Going back to the original position, if King h1 and g4, white does not play f takes on g4 because e4 will win for black, but plays King g2 and King d2. If instead g takes on f3 check, King takes on f3 followed by King e4 will draw. So King d2, f takes on g4, e4, and mere counting will show that both sides queen drawing the game. If the student will now take the trouble to go back to the examples of king and pawns which I have given in this book, they will realize that in all of them the matter of the opposition is of paramount importance, as in fact it is in nearly all endings of king and pawns, except in such cases where the pawn position in itself ensures the win. Moving further, Capablanca discusses the next topic under the heading number 14, the relative value of knight and bishop. He writes, Before turning our attention to this matter, it is well to state now that two knights alone cannot mate. But under certain conditions, of course, they can do so if the opponent has one or more pawns. Example 29. In the position on board, white cannot win, although the black king is cornered. But in the following position, in which black has a pawn, white wins with or without the move. Thus, knight g6 and h4. White cannot take the pawn because the game will be drawn, as explained before. Knight e5, h3, knight c6, h2, knight b5, h1 queen, and knight c7 mate. The reason for this peculiarity in chess is evident. White with the two knights can only stalemate the king unless black has a pawn which can be moved. Example 30. Although white is a bishop and a pawn ahead, the following position cannot be won by white. It is the greatest weakness of the bishop that when the rook's pawn queens on a square of opposite color and the opposing king is in front of the pawn, the bishop is absolutely worthless. All that black has to do is keep moving their king close to the corner square. Example 31. In the position on board, white with or without the move can win. Take the most difficult variation. King h2, knight g4 check, king h1, king f1, g5, king f2, h2, knight e3, g4, knight f1, g3 check, and knight takes on g3 mate. Now that we have seen these exceptional cases, we can analyze the different merits and the relative value of the knight and the bishop. It is generally thought by amateurs that the knight is the more valuable piece of the two. The chief reason being that, unlike the bishop, the knight can command both black and white squares. However, the fact is generally overlooked that the knight at any one time has the choice of one color only. It takes much longer to bring a knight from one wing to the other. Also, as shown in the following example, number 32, a bishop can stalemate a knight, a compliment which the knight is unable to return. The weaker the player, the more terrible the knight is to them. But as a player increases in strength, the value of the bishop becomes more evident to them. And of course, there is or should be a corresponding decrease in their estimation of the value of the knight as compared to the bishop. In this respect, as in many others, the masters of today are far ahead of the masters of former generations. While not so long ago, some of the very best amongst them, like Pillsbury and Chigorin, preferred knights to bishops, there is hardly a master of today who would not completely agree with the statements made above. Example 33. This is about the only case when the knight is more valuable than the bishop. It is what is called a block position, and all the pawns are on one side of the board. If there were pawns on both sides of the board, there would be no advantage in having a knight. In such a position, black has excellent chances of winning. Of course, there is an extra source of weakness for white in having their pawns on the same color squares as their bishop. This is a mistake often made by players. The proper way generally in an ending is to have your pawns on squares of opposite color to that of your own bishop. When you have your pawns on squares of the same color, the action of your own bishop is limited by them, and consequently the value of the bishop is diminished, since the value of a piece can often be measured by the number of squares it commands. While on this subject, I shall also call attention to the fact that it is generally preferable to keep your pawns on squares of the same color as that of the opposing bishop, particularly if they are passed pawns supported by the king. The principles might be stated thus: when the opponent has a bishop, keep your pawns on squares of the same color as of your opponent's bishop. Whenever you have a bishop, whether the opponent has also one or not, keep your pawns on squares of the opposite color to that of your own bishop. Naturally, these principles have sometimes to be modified to suit the exigencies or requirements of the position. Example 34. In the following position, the pawns are on one side of the board, and there is no advantage in having either a knight or a bishop. The game should surely end in a draw. Example 35. Now let us add 3 pawns on each side to the previous position, so that there are pawns on both sides of the board. It is now preferable to have the bishop, though the position, if properly played out, should end in a draw. The advantage of having the bishop lies as much in its ability to command at long range both sides of the board from a central position, as in its ability to move quickly from one side of the board to the other. Example 36. In the position on board, it is unquestionably an advantage to have the bishop, because although each player has the same number of pawns, they are not balanced on each side of the board. Thus, on the king side, white has 3 to 2, while on the queen side, it is black that has 3 to 2. Still, with proper play, the game should end in a draw, though white has somewhat better chances. Example 37. Here is a position in which to have the bishop is a decided advantage, since not only are there pawns on both sides of the board, but there is a passed pawn, h pawn for white, a pawn for black. Black should have extreme difficulty in drawing this position, if they can do it at all. Example 38. Again, black would have great difficulty in drawing this position. The student should carefully consider these positions. I hope that the many examples will help them to understand in their true value the relative merits of the knight and bishop. As to the general method of procedure, a teacher or practical experience will be best. I might say generally, however, that the proper course in these endings, as in all similar endings, is advance of the king to the center of the board, or towards the passed pawns, or pawns that are susceptible of being attacked, and rapid advance of the passed pawn or pawns as far as is consistent with their safety. To give a fixed line of play would be folly. Each ending is different and requires different handling according to what the adversary proposes to do. Calculation by visualizing the future positions is what will count. Moving further, Capablanca discusses the next topic under the heading number 15, how to mate with a knight and a bishop. He writes, now before going back again to the middle game and the openings, let us see how to mate with knight and bishop, and then how to win with a queen against a rook. With a knight and a bishop, the mate can only be given in the corners of the same color as the bishop. Example 39. In this example, we must mate either at A1 or H8. The ending can be divided into two parts. Part 1 consists in driving the black king to the last line. We might begin, as is generally done in all such cases, by advancing the king to the center of the board. King E2 and King D7. Black, in order to make it more difficult, goes towards the white squared corner. King D3, King C6. Bishop F4, King D5, Knight E2, King C5, Knight C3, King B4, King D4, King A5, King C5, King A6, King C6, King A7, Knight D5, and King A8. The first part is now over. The black king is in the white squared corner. The second and last part will consist in driving the black king from A8 to A1 or H8. In order to mate him, A1 will be the quickest in this position. Knight B6 check, King A7, Bishop C7, King A6, Bishop B8, King A8, Knight D5, and King A4. Black tries to make for H1 with their king. White has two ways to prevent that. One by Bishop E5, King B3, Knight E3, and the other, which I give as the text and which I consider better for the student to learn because it is more methodical and more in accord with the spirit of all these endings, by using the king as much as possible. So King A4, King C5, King B3, Knight B4, King C3, Bishop F4, King B3, Bishop E5, King A4, King C4, King A5, Bishop C7 check, King A4, Knight D3, King A3, Bishop B6, King A4, Knight B2 check, king a3, king c3, king a2, king c2, king a3, bishop c5 check, king a2, knight d3, king a1, bishop b4, king a2, knight c1 check, king a1 and bishop c3 mate. It will be seen that the ending is rather laborious. There are two outstanding features: the close following by the king and the controlling of the squares of opposite color to the bishop by the combined action of the knight and the king. The student would do well to exercise themselves methodically in this ending, as it gives a very good idea of the actual power of the pieces, and it requires foresight in order to accomplish the mate within 50 moves, which are granted by the rules. Moving further, Capablanca discusses the next topic under the heading number 16, Queen against Rook. He writes, "This is one of the most difficult endings without pawns. The resources of the defense are many, and when used skillfully, only a very good player will prevail within the limit of 50 moves allowed by the rules. The rule is that at any moment you may demand that your opponent mates you within 50 moves. However, every time a piece is exchanged or a pawn advanced, the counting must begin afresh." Example 40. This is one of the standard positions which black can often bring about. Now it is white's move. If it were black's move, it would be simple, as they would have to move their rook away from the king, find out why, and then the rook would be comparatively easy to win. We deduce from the above that the main object is to force the black rook away from the defending king, and that in order to compel black to do so, we must bring about the position on board with black to move. Once we know what is required, the way to proceed becomes easier to find. Thus, Queen e5 check, not a Queen a6 because of a Rook c7 check, King b6, Rook c6 check, and king takes on c6, stalemate. The beginner will invariably fall into this trap. So, Queen e5 check, King a8 or King a7, Queen a1 check, King b8, and Queen a5. In a few moves, we have accomplished our object. The first part is concluded. Now we come to the second part. The rook can only go to a white square, otherwise the first check with the queen will win it. Therefore, Rook b3, Queen e5 check, King a8, Queen h8 check, King a7, Queen h7 check, King a8, Queen g8 check, Rook b8, and Queen a2 mate. The student should find out by themselves how to win when Rook b1 here instead of Rook b3, Queen e5 check, and King a7. Example 41. The procedure here is very similar. The things to bear in mind are that the rook must be prevented from interposing at b8 because of an immediate mate. And in the same way, the king must be prevented from going either to a6 or c8. Alright, we conclude this part of Capablanca's chess fundamentals here, and we shall continue onwards from the next one. Here is a look at the recent channel support from my Twitch stream. 2 new supporters, Blademaster and Alex Alachin. Alex Alachin is a fellow chess streamer. I will post a link to his stream in the video description. Do check it out. Thank you for the kind support, everyone. Much appreciated. Till next time, take care.